Hey guys, tonight we settle into the ordinary world of medieval life, just before the storm that would change everything. Although, of course, you have no idea that the worst nightmare is quietly gathering just beyond the horizon. Imagine yourself wandering cobblestone streets, the air thick with smoke from wood fires, and the smell of fresh bread from the baker's shop mingling with less pleasant odors of livestock and waste. It's the kind of world where daily routine feels comforting and predictable, even if the standards of hygiene leave a little to be desired. You trudge past market stalls buzzing with hawkers shouting their wares, townsfolk bargaining for cloth and salted fish, children darting between carts pulled by sturdy draft horses. The rhythm of life here is slow, steady, almost soothing. You might even find yourself nodding off while watching a potter spin his wheel, or listening to the dull drone of monks chanting in the monastery just beyond the village green. But beneath this surface calm, something darker is stirring. You probably won't survive this. That's the grim reality of what's to come. Though tonight, the only thing weighing on your mind is whether the ale at the tavern will be strong enough to dull your worries. You brush aside the stray dog eyeing your scraps, oblivious to the tiny hitchhikers crawling in the shadows, fleas on rats, those unassuming agents of chaos. But more on those little monsters later. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Feel free to drop your location and local time down below. I'm always curious to see who's joining this slow history trip from which there's no quick escape. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Life in medieval Europe before the plague was a curious mix of the mundane and the mysterious, much like a sleepy town that hides secrets behind its quiet facade. Your days begin early with the crowing of roosters, the clatter of wooden shoes on stone, and the low murmur of neighbors exchanging news, often the kind you wouldn't want to hear. In this world, the seasons dictate everything. Planting and harvest seasons are intense, while the harsh winters force you indoors where smoke from the hearth curls around beams, and you huddle with family and friends, telling stories or playing simple games by candlelight. Your diet probably isn't winning any Michelin stars, but it keeps you alive. Thick porridge, coarse bread, sometimes salted fish, or a small piece of boiled meat. Herbs, when you can find them, add a bit of flavor, and sometimes a touch of medicinal hope. Remember that one time you heard about people using crocodile dung as sunscreen. Odd little tidbits like that reveal just how creative and desperate people got with remedies and everyday needs. Hygiene is nothing like the sparkling standards we expect today. Bathing might be a rare luxury, and soap, if available, is a pricey treasure. Villages and towns are tightly knit, with social structure layered in a way that feels rigid, but somehow manageable. Lords and ladies preside over the land, serfs and peasants toil in the fields, and merchants hustle in market squares. Religion is woven into every fabric of life. The church bells mark the hours, and priests guide your spiritual as well as social compass. Festivals and holy days punctuate the calendar, offering rare moments of joy and celebration. But let's pause here, because historians still argue whether medieval life was as bleak as some portray it, or if there was a quiet contentment in the slow rhythms and close communities. Some scholars point to archaeological finds of well-built homes, balanced diets in certain regions, and evidence of leisure activities like board games and music to suggest people enjoyed their lives more than the usual doom and gloom narratives led on. Of course, the shadow of death was never far in the medieval mind. Infant mortality was high. Plagues and famines came and went, and medical knowledge was rudimentary at best. You might think of a time when life expectancy was short, but remember, people still lived well into their 50s or 60s if they made it past childhood and avoided calamities. Yet, the ever-present possibility of sudden illness lent a certain somberness to daily existence. Death was almost a constant companion, sometimes depicted in art and literature as a skeletal figure reminding you that no one escapes its grasp. As you wander the streets, you pass by the blacksmith hammering iron, the mill grinding grain, and the women tending their hearths. The chatter is lively, but tinged with superstition. Folks whisper about strange happenings, a bad harvest, an ill omen, or a mysterious sickness in a neighboring town. These stories spread fast, feeding the communal nerves. You might roll your eyes, but deep down, you're aware that these signs often presage something worse. Meanwhile, marketplaces bustle with trade goods brought in by traveling merchants. Spices from the east, colorful cloth, and exotic fruits are luxuries that hint at a wider world beyond your village walls. Yet the contrast between wealth and poverty is stark. Some townsfolk live in cramped, filthy quarters, their homes barely more than wooden shacks, while a wealthy merchant's house might boast a sturdy stone foundation and glazed windows. You catch the scent of freshly baked bread drifting through the air, mixed with the earthy aroma of livestock and the pungent tang of uncollected waste. Remember, medieval sanitation is a concept that would make modern city planners shudder. Open gutters, cesspits, and the occasional street dumping keep the village relatively functional, but not exactly hygienic. It's easy to romanticize this era, imagining knights in shining armor and grand castles. But for most people, life is a series of hard tasks punctuated by small pleasures. You might have a favorite spot by the village well or a bench in the churchyard where you watch the sun dip below the horizon. These moments offer a quiet kind of peace, a brief respite before the coming storm. And what a storm it will be. The Black Death, when it arrives, doesn't announce itself with fanfare. There's no dramatic trumpet call or ominous thunder. Instead, it creeps in silently, hitching a ride on those tiny fleas that thrive on the common rat. The rats themselves are unremarkable, scurrying through your alleys and rooftops, oblivious to the chaos they'll unleash. Before the plague, towns have their rhythms, Markets open and close. Craftsmen hone their skills. Children play in the dirt. You might even get a chance to hear a traveling bard sing a tale of heroes, or listen to a monk's chants echoing softly through stone walls. These sounds, smells, and sights form the backdrop of your world, comforting in their familiarity. Yet beneath it all, there's an uneasy sense that things could change. Traders bring news from faraway lands, a war here, a famine there, strange illnesses reported in distant ports. Rumors of a sickness spreading across the Mediterranean start to trickle in. But it feels distant, like a story from a different world. You shrug it off, focusing instead on the daily grind, repairing your roof before winter, mending your clothes, preparing the fields. And so, you settle into your medieval life, blissfully unaware that soon you will face the most terrifying nightmare of the age. A nightmare that will sweep through your village, upend your routines, and make you question everything you thought you knew about safety and survival. You probably won't survive this, but tonight, you don't know that yet. For now, the world feels quiet, slow, and strangely peaceful. The Black Death arrives not with a roar, but like a ghostly whisper carried on the backs of rats, slipping through the cracks of your everyday life. You don't notice the first rat. It's just another scruffy creature scavenging for crumbs near the marketplace. Neither do you see the flea that leaps aboard, tiny enough to escape your notice. Yet these minuscule actors are about to rewrite the fate of your entire world. Imagine it. You're walking home from the market, the scent of fresh herbs and baked bread still clinging to the air. Suddenly, the quiet shifts, though you can't quite put your finger on why. Maybe it's the odd silence in the usually bustling streets, or the hollow looks on your neighbors' faces as they hurriedly shut their doors. A plague is spreading, and it's hitching a ride across continents on the backs of black rats, a species common in your town's granaries and stables. You might wonder why rats. Well, these rodents thrive in the cramped, dirty conditions of medieval towns. They're excellent at sneaking into your food stores, your homes, and your barns, carrying fleas that are the true villains here. These fleas feed on infected rats, and then hop onto humans, biting and injecting the deadly bacteria Yersinia pestis. Flea bites might be an everyday nuisance for you now, but in a matter of days, they could turn your life upside down. Historians still argue whether the Black Death spread primarily through fleas, or if airborne transmission played a larger role, especially once the infection reached human lungs. But either way, the disease's arrival feels like a slow, creeping shadow that gradually darkens your once familiar world. Before long, ships laden with grain, spices, and unfortunately, rats, dock in nearby ports. Those ships bring more than just goods. They carry the plague from the bustling trade hubs of the East into Europe's heartlands. You probably hear whispers about sickness in far-off places like Constantinople or Genoa, but the news feels distant, like tales from a dream. Then the first cases appear in your town. Someone you know, maybe the blacksmith's apprentice or the miller's wife, falls ill with strange symptoms. They retreat into their home, fevered and trembling. Soon after, others start to follow. Panic begins to ripple through the streets, but rational explanations are scarce. After all, no one understands how this invisible enemy spreads. You might be tempted to think the plague is a punishment from God, or that it's caused by foul air or bad smells, the so-called miasma. People clutch herbs or burn incense, hoping to ward off the invisible menace. Some even carry flowers, believing the sweet scents can purify the air. It's a quaint idea, but sadly ineffective. And what about the rats? Well, while they carry the fleas, many people don't yet understand their role in the plague's spread. Some towns see fewer rats and mistakenly assume the disease is gone, not realizing the fleas can jump to other hosts, including you. Others notice the rat population suddenly plummeting, a grim sign that the plague is ravaging more than just humans. Interestingly, some fringe theories propose that the disease's spread might have involved more than just rats and fleas, perhaps even lice, or other biting insects common in dirty clothing. Still, historians debate these possibilities. The exact mechanics of transmission are a tangled web of science and speculation, one that's only been partially unraveled centuries later. As the plague spreads, you notice the first signs in your community. Neighbors vanish behind shuttered doors, markets begin to empty, and an eerie hush replaces the usual clamor. The smell of smoke from funeral pyres mingles with the usual odors of livestock and manure, layering your world with a suffocating weight. You watch as ships are turned away from ports, refused entry because their crews are sick or dead. Borders tighten, and rumors of quarantines begin. The idea of shutting oneself away to prevent disease might sound familiar now, but back then, it was a novel and desperate strategy. Even animals seemed to sense the change. Cats and dogs disappear from the streets, and wild creatures venture closer to abandoned homes. The balance of life is shifting, and you can't help but feel the world tipping on its axis. One of the eeriest aspects is how the disease respects no boundaries. It kills the rich and poor alike, nobles and peasants falling to the same grim fate. Some of the greatest minds and wealthiest families vanish in months, their estates left to crumble. Yet, as devastating as it is, the plague is also oddly democratic in its destruction. You might have thought wealth could buy protection, but it can't buy immunity. Some noble courts become ghost towns overnight, while some poor villages are spared entirely. It's a cruel lottery, one that defies logic and fuels superstition. You can almost feel the weight of this invisible terror pressing down on your chest as you walk past empty homes and shuttered shops. Fear becomes a living thing, twisting conversations and friendships. No one knows whom to trust or where the next case will appear. In these moments, strange customs begin to emerge. Some people flee the cities, hoping that distance will save them. Others hunker down, barricading themselves inside, clutching talismans and holy relics. And yet others turn to desperate measures, blame the outsiders, the foreigners, or marginalized groups, sparking dangerous scapegoating and violence. The idea that the plague could be spread through contact with the other becomes dangerously popular. You might hear stories of entire communities attacking Jews or lepers, convinced they are agents of the disease. Of course, such scapegoating is tragically misguided and fueled by fear rather than fact. Meanwhile, towns scramble to handle the growing number of dead. Graveyards overflow, and mass burials become the grim new normal. The sound of cartwheels hauling away bodies fills the air, a haunting soundtrack to a world unraveling. It's worth noting that while the plague's devastation is immense, some towns and regions manage to avoid the worst. Geographic isolation, local climate, and chance all play roles in the plague's patchy map. But for most, the slow arrival of the Black Death means an impossible choice. Try to flee, barricade, or simply endure as the invisible enemy moves closer to your doorstep. You might notice a peculiar mix of denial and fatalism among your neighbors. Some refuse to believe it will come to their town. Others accept their fate with a quiet resignation. There's no playbook for this kind of disaster. The arrival of the Black Death doesn't just threaten your health, it shatters the very fabric of society. Trade grinds to a halt, food becomes scarce, and the trust that holds communities together starts to erode. It's a slow-motion collapse, with each new case driving deeper fear into your heart. You might find yourself avoiding your own family, unsure if the person you shared bread with yesterday is now a carrier. Social rituals collapse. Weddings are postponed indefinitely, and funerals become hurried affairs without the usual comforts. In the midst of this, the human mind reaches for explanations and control. Some turn to prayer and fasting, hoping to appease divine wrath. Others seek out healers who promise cures, often in exchange for gold. It's a desperate dance with hope and despair. The Black Death's arrival is not just a historical event. It's a profound human tragedy that rewrites how people think about disease, community, and survival. And as you stand on the cusp of this dark chapter, you realize the world you knew is slipping away, replaced by a nightmare you never imagined. You wake up feeling strange, like you've been caught between a fevered dream and reality. Maybe it started with a shiver, a chill that creeps along your spine despite the summer heat. You rub your arms, hoping to shake the cold away, but it settles in, stubborn and unwelcome. Soon, your head pounds as if a tiny blacksmith is hammering away inside your skull. You're hot, then cold, and then hot again. The cycle repeats, robbing you of rest and any hope of normalcy. Then the first telltale signs appear, those infamous buboes. You might not even know what to call them yet, but these swollen, painful lumps form in your armpits, groin, or neck. They look like angry bruises, often black or purple, and they ache in a way that makes even the gentlest touch unbearable. When you feel them, it's like your body is trying to scream. Something is very wrong. You notice other symptoms too. Headaches that throb relentlessly, vomiting, nausea, and a weakness that settles deep into your bones. You can barely stand, let alone walk to the market or tend the animals. Every breath feels heavy, and you find yourself gasping for air as if your lungs are weighed down by invisible chains. The terrifying thing is how fast this all happens. One day you're well enough to chat with a neighbor, and the next, you're curled in a dark corner, sweating through your thin linen shirt, wondering if you'll see dawn. You probably don't know it, but your lymphatic system is waging a desperate war against the Yersinia pestis bacteria. It invades your bloodstream, multiplying quickly, overwhelming your body's defenses. Those swollen buboes are your lymph nodes fighting for survival, inflamed and choked with infection. Historians still argue whether all plague victims displayed buboes, or if some suffered from the pneumonic form, where infection attacks the lungs, spreading through coughs and sneezes like wildfire. The pneumonic plague is even deadlier, capable of killing within days, sometimes hours. It's the reason that hospitals, if you could call them that, filled up so fast. You might have heard that the plague kills swiftly, but the truth is more complicated. Some people survive the initial fever and buboes, only to relapse weeks later. Others succumb quickly, their bodies overwhelmed before loved ones can react. Doctors of the time, bless their hearts, had little understanding of the disease. They'd try to lance the buboes, hoping to drain the poison, but more often than not, they only spread the infection further. Their attempts were a mix of desperate hope and ignorance. Strangely, in some cases, victims displayed symptoms like coughing up blood or delirium, while others seemed to slip away quietly in their sleep. The diversity of symptoms only added to the fear and confusion. You might wonder if any remedies helped. The answer is complicated. Some medieval treatments involved herbal poultices, the burning of aromatic woods, and the use of spices thought to ward off evil. Others turned to bloodletting or leeches, hoping to balance the body's humors. Spoiler alert, these treatments rarely helped and sometimes made things worse. In fact, some of the cures sound downright bizarre today. People believed that wearing amulets filled with crushed gems or carrying aromatic herbs could protect them. Others thought bathing in vinegar or urine might cleanse the body. At least one fringe remedy involved drinking mercury, which was, unsurprisingly, toxic. You might recall that bizarre sunscreen made from crocodile dung. Well, the medical world of the Middle Ages was full of such oddities, a testament to human creativity when faced with the unknown. Despite all this, some survivors did exist. Whether through sheer luck, strong immune systems, or a less severe strain of the plague, they became living proof that death wasn't inevitable. Their tales spread slowly, offering a fragile thread of hope. Meanwhile, the psychological toll of the symptoms was immense. Imagine the terror of waking up with a lump growing under your arm, knowing it could mean death. The isolation alone was soul-crushing. Sick people often shut themselves away, fearful of infecting family members or being shunned by neighbors. The spread of symptoms could be rapid and unpredictable. 1 minute you're healthy, the next bedridden and fighting for breath. The uncertainty bred panic and despair in equal measure. In some towns, families watched helplessly as members succumbed one after another. There was no hospice care or pain relief as we know it today. Just prayer, whispered goodbyes, and the cold silence of death. Curiously, some fringe medical theories suggested that the disease might be a form of divine punishment for sins or a test of faith. This belief shaped much of how people experienced their illness, often bringing comfort through spiritual acceptance or deepening despair. The visible symptoms also had social implications. People with buboes were often feared and avoided, sometimes even by their own families. This social isolation only deepened the loneliness and fear associated with the disease. In towns and villages, you might witness neighbors avoiding those who showed symptoms, or forcibly quarantining the sick in separate dwellings. The early concept of isolation was born from these desperate efforts. As you lie in your dimly lit room, the fever burning your skin, you might catch the faint sound of bells tolling for another lost soul. The grim procession grows daily, an unending reminder of the plague's ruthless efficiency. And yet, in these dark moments, humanity's resilience flickers. Caregivers, often family members, sometimes brave strangers, risk their own lives to tend the sick. It's a quiet, heartbreaking kindness amid the chaos. You can almost hear the hushed prayers, whispered promises, and tears falling onto rough wooden floors. It's a world stripped to its rawest emotions: fear, love, despair, and hope. Historians still debate the exact mortality rate of the Black Death, with estimates ranging from a third to over half of Europe's population perishing. It's a staggering number that reshaped societies in ways no one could have imagined. The symptoms you endure are more than physical. They're a brutal gateway into a shared experience of suffering and loss that transcends time. As your body battles the plague, the world outside begins to crumble under its weight. But even in the darkest night, the first rays of dawn are beginning to stir, though you wouldn't know it yet. Survivors will emerge, communities will rebuild, and the echoes of those painful buboes will linger in stories told for generations. For now, you hold on to each breath, each moment, knowing that the nightmare has truly begun. You sit back, hoping that the doctors of your day might offer some salvation. But instead, you find yourself wrapped in a swirl of bewildering medical missteps. Imagine a scene where men in long robes and strange hats cluster around a sickbed, armed not with microscopes or vaccines, but with leeches, herbs, and theories that sound more like ancient magic than science. These doctors, bless their earnest intentions, are trying everything they can. But what they're fighting is an invisible enemy they barely understand. Their toolkit is a curious mix of the bizarre and the desperate. Bloodletting is one of their favorite methods, based on the age-old belief in balancing the body's humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. The idea is that by draining excess blood, you could restore health. So, you might find yourself having a deep vein opened or covered in leeches, a process more likely to weaken than help you. The logic sounds sound for the time, but in reality, it's like trying to fix a leaking ship by drilling more holes. You could also find doctors prescribing aromatic treatments. They burn fragrant woods, sprinkle herbs, and carry posies of flowers or pungent spices, hoping the sweet or sharp smells will drive away the bad air they believe causes illness. Remember, they call this miasma theory, and it's as popular as it is ineffective. It's almost cute to think of people wearing bunches of herbs around their necks, like walking gardens in the middle of a crisis. Surgeons might resort to the lancing of buboes, hoping to drain what they thought was poisonous fluid. Unfortunately, this invasive approach often spread the infection further, turning a hopeful treatment into a deadly gamble. Imagine the grim scene of a doctor wielding a knife without anesthesia, probing swollen lymph nodes in dim candlelight. You wince just thinking about it. Odd remedies abound. Some believe that burning a plague victim's belongings, or even their clothing, can halt the disease. Others turn to concoctions, mixing mercury, garlic, or onions, ingredients that may smell foul, but were thought to have purifying powers. There's even a notion that bathing in vinegar or placing a live frog on buboes might help, though you'd be forgiven for suspecting this was more superstition than medicine. You might recall those crocodile dung sunscreens we joked about before. Well, some plague treatments were equally bizarre. People drank mixtures containing heavy metals or consumed powders made from crushed gems, hoping these could counteract the disease. Spoiler alert, they didn't. Amid these strange remedies, you'd also find the rise of apothecaries, early pharmacists who sold herbal medicines, salves, and potions. Their shelves are crowded with jars labeled angelica root or stinking iris. And while some plants had mild, soothing properties, none were plague cures. Sometimes these remedies were more about hope and ritual than actual healing. Doctors also wore those iconic plague masks with beak-like noses stuffed with herbs and spices, hoping to filter out the miasma. Those beaked masks look straight out of a Gothic novel, but they were a genuine attempt at protection, albeit a misguided one. The masks, combined with waxed robes and gloves, made plague doctors look like eerie harbingers of doom, wandering from house to house. It's fascinating to note that these doctors were often outsiders, both feared and respected, because they faced the sick when others fled. Their role was a grim one, tending to the ill, documenting deaths, and sometimes administering last rites. Yet, even their presence was tinged with dread. Seeing a plague doctor approach often meant someone close was about to be lost. Of course, many physicians were powerless to stop the disease, leading to widespread disillusionment with the medical establishment. Some people abandoned their practices altogether, while others doubled down on faith and superstition instead. Historians still argue whether the medical community's responses helped prolong the plague's misery, or if they inadvertently hastened its spread. The truth likely lies somewhere in the middle, a mix of earnest effort and tragic misunderstanding. Meanwhile, the general population tries to make sense of what's happening, turning to folk remedies and home treatments passed down through generations. Garlic hung in doorways, amulets worn as talismans, and the ritual burning of incense become common sights. Interestingly, some families resorted to burning their possessions or entire homes to cleanse the disease, a drastic step fueled by fear and desperation. You can almost smell the smoke rising from the ashes, mixing with the ever-present sense of decay and desperation. As treatments fail and death tolls rise, doctors become symbols of both hope and helplessness. They might carry a ledger of names, watching their town's population shrink with each passing day. Some document symptoms and outcomes in the earliest attempts at epidemiology, laying groundwork for future understanding, even if they themselves don't grasp the full picture. It's also worth mentioning the role of women in healthcare during this time. While male doctors received most recognition, many women served as midwives, herbalists, and caregivers, tending to the sick with limited means but boundless compassion. Their contributions, though often unrecorded, were vital. In the background of these medical struggles, society groans under the weight of panic. The streets grow quieter, the marketplaces less crowded, and you can almost hear the collective holding of breath. People avoid doctors because visiting one might mean certain death. Yet, they crave the knowledge and comfort doctors offer. You might find yourself caught in a strange paradox, seeking help while fearing what that help might bring. The unknown nature of the disease makes every decision a gamble. Despite the darkness, some of the medical theories and practices of the time sow the seeds for later breakthroughs. The focus on quarantine, for example, began to emerge from the recognition that isolation could slow transmission, and the documentation of symptoms and mortality rates laid the foundation for modern epidemiology. The plague doctors' robes and masks, while ineffective, represent one of humanity's first attempts at personal protective equipment, a sobering reminder of how much we owe to those early, fumbling steps in medicine. So as you lie there weary and fevered, you can't help but feel the tragic weight of those doctors' efforts. Their hands are steady, their hearts heavy, but but the invisible enemy outmatches them at every turn. Their treatments are a mix of hope, tradition, and trial, and in the end, sometimes, a quiet surrender. The night deepens, the candles gutter, and the battle between medieval medicine and the Black Death rages on, silent, relentless, and devastating. The streets you once knew as lively and familiar are now shadows of themselves. The bustling markets have quieted, the lively chatter replaced by an uneasy silence, punctuated only by the occasional distant bell tolling for the dead. You trudge through deserted lanes where the scent of fresh bread has been overtaken by the stench of abandonment and decay. Shops are shuttered, windows boarded up, and the usual hum of life is gone. It feels like the world is holding its breath, waiting for something dreadful to happen, and in a way, it already has. As the plague advances, society begins to unravel, not just from the weight of illness, but from the paralyzing fear gripping every heart. Towns empty as families flee in hopes of escaping the invisible killer. You might see groups packing hastily, carts overloaded with whatever they can carry, leaving behind homes and livelihoods. Roads once busy with merchants and travelers are now eerily quiet, save for the creak of wagon wheels and the occasional sobbing of those left behind. The markets that once were the heartbeat of your town, brimming with fresh produce, textiles, and gossip, now lie empty. The smell of spoiled food and mold creeps in, a quiet testament to the sudden halt of daily commerce. Merchants shutter their stalls and vanish, their usual customers too afraid to venture outside. Even the local tavern, a place where stories were swapped and laughter shared, falls silent, its empty tables collecting dust. Community gatherings, church services, festivals, weddings are abandoned, swallowed by dread. Without these social anchors, the threads holding your world together begin to fray. Neighbors who once shared meals and celebrations now cross the street to avoid one another. Suspicion and superstition growing in the void left by trust. Fear spreads faster than the plague itself. Rumors abound, some saying that the disease is a curse sent to punish sins, others blaming foreign traders or marginalized groups. In a cruel twist, scapegoating takes root. Entire communities, especially Jewish populations, become targets of violence and persecution, accused without evidence of poisoning wells or summoning the disease. The madness of fear blinds reason, turning neighbors into enemies. Public officials struggle to maintain order, but are overwhelmed. Some towns appoint plague wardens to enforce rudimentary quarantines or clean the streets, but resources and manpower are scarce. Lawlessness creeps in as desperate people steal food or abandon their duties. The thin veneer of civilization starts to peel away. You might find yourself witnessing a haunting scene. Mass graves hastily dug on the outskirts of town, where the dead are buried in rows, stacked like firewood. The clatter of shovels fills the air, and the grim procession of bodies carted away from homes becomes a daily reminder of the plague's toll. Funeral rites are truncated or skipped altogether, denying the dead and the living the comfort of closure. At the same time, economic activity grinds to a halt. With so many sick or dead, farmers leave fields unplowed, crops rot in the sun, and food shortages loom. Supply chains break down as transporters fall ill or refuse to travel. Prices for basic goods skyrocket, and hunger joins disease as a formidable enemy. Historians still argue whether the social collapse was inevitable, or if communities could have fared better with different responses. Some point to towns that managed partial quarantine measures or communal care as examples of resilience. But for many, the chaos is overwhelming. Amid the turmoil, ordinary people adapt in unexpected ways. You might find yourself in a strange new world where survival trumps tradition. Marriages happen quietly or not at all. Children grow up without parents. Entire families are wiped out. Community roles shift. Those who remain take on unfamiliar tasks to fill gaps left by the dead. Interestingly, some craftsmen and laborers find themselves in higher demand. With fewer workers around, their skills become precious, setting the stage for social shifts that will emerge later. But for now, survival is a daily struggle. You might notice that some people turn inward, withdrawing from society in fear or grief, while others band together for mutual support. Small groups share food, care for the sick, and try to maintain some semblance of normal life. It's a testament to human resilience, even amid despair. Religious leaders wrestle with their own crises of faith and duty. While some double down on sermons warning of divine punishment, others provide solace and hope, tending to both spiritual and physical needs. Processions and prayers become common sights, attempts to appease what many believe is a wrathful God. Yet these religious activities sometimes backfire. Crowds gathering for processions may unwittingly help spread the plague further, turning faith into a double-edged sword. Historians still debate the impact of such gatherings on the course of the epidemic. The fabric of medieval society, tightly woven by customs, faith, and social roles, is tearing apart. You walk through streets where the law no longer seems to hold sway, where fear breeds cruelty and desperation. You see neighbors abandoned by their own families, children left to fend for themselves, and the rich retreating behind fortified walls. In this chaos, some surprisingly practical measures take hold. Towns begin to adopt quarantine laws, restricting entry and exit, attempting to isolate the sick. Though crude and often inconsistently applied, these measures mark a turning point in public health responses. You might be surprised to learn that the very word quarantine comes from this era, originally referring to a 40-day isolation period for ships before they could dock, designed to prevent disease spread. This concept, born of necessity, becomes a cornerstone of future epidemic control. Meanwhile, the plague changes how people view death and community. Fear and grief are constant companions, yet people find ways to honor the dead, even in the face of overwhelming loss. Makeshift cemeteries and memorials spring up, offering a space for mourning amid the chaos. Through all this, the human spirit flickers, sometimes weakly, sometimes fiercely. You witness acts of courage, kindness, and stubborn hope that contrast sharply with the darkness around you. It's a complicated dance of despair and resilience, chaos and order, death and survival. So, as you walk the deserted streets, surrounded by silence and shadows, remember that this chaos is not just the plague itself, but the unraveling of a world struggling to cope. The nightmare you live through is not only about disease, but the collapse of the social ties that once made life bearable. And as the plague continues to spread, it lays the groundwork for profound changes in society, economy, and culture shifts that will ripple for centuries to come. You may have heard of quarantine as a modern invention, a response to recent pandemics, but its roots stretch back deep into the desperate days of the Black Death. As towns and cities struggled to halt the invisible invader, a new idea took hold, one that would forever change how humanity confronts disease. Imagine a world where the concept of isolation was foreign, where neighbors crowded into cramped homes and travel was unrestricted. Then suddenly, you find yourself confined, your movements curtailed by law and fear alike. In the early days of the plague, officials and health experts, though still working with little understanding, noticed that ships arriving from infected ports often brought sickness with them. To combat this, maritime cities like Venice and Ragusa pioneered the practice of quarantina, requiring ships to remain anchored for 40 days before docking. This period, a kind of forced timeout, was believed to be long enough to allow any disease on board to reveal itself or burn out. 40 days, by the way, had symbolic weight. Biblical numerology made the number familiar and seemingly sacred, lending gravitas to this grim rule. You can almost picture sailors, cramped and frustrated, stuck on their vessels, while the plague raged both outside and within their own crowded quarters. This was no leisurely vacation. Quarantine was an enforced sentence of uncertainty, suspicion, and often despair. But it marked the beginning of a fundamental shift. That isolation could save lives. Soon, cities adopted similar rules for newcomers on land. Travelers were held in quarantine stations called lazarettos, named after Lazarus, the biblical figure associated with illness and resurrection. These were often remote or isolated buildings where the sick could be separated from the healthy. Though conditions were grim and comfort was rare, the word lazaretto may evoke eerie images today. But back then, it was a beacon of hope, a shield between the healthy and the infected. Yet the implementation was uneven. Some towns enforced strict isolation with guards and penalties, while others were lax, allowing people to slip through the cracks. This inconsistency helped spread the plague even further. Interestingly, some communities extended quarantine practices to entire households, requiring families of the infected to remain shut indoors for weeks, sometimes months. Imagine the psychological toll of confinement in cramped, poorly ventilated homes, compounded by fear, hunger, and illness. In these conditions, plague could spread quickly among family members, but at least the wider community had a chance to breathe. Historians still argue whether quarantine was more effective as a medical intervention or as a social control mechanism. On one hand, isolating the sick undeniably slowed disease spread. On the other, it exacerbated social divides and hardships, sometimes leading to civil unrest. People often resented being locked away, especially when support was minimal and rumors ran rampant. There are stories of desperate families attempting to flee quarantine, only to be caught and punished severely. In some cases, guards at quarantine stations were bribed to turn a blind eye, undermining public health efforts. You can imagine the tension in these situations, where survival instincts clash with communal responsibility. Quarantine also reshaped travel and trade. Merchants faced delays and uncertainty, disrupting supply chains and economies. Some routes became too risky, while others flourished by enforcing strict health protocols. This patchwork of practices created an uneven map of plague transmission. In addition to official quarantine, people adopted informal isolation tactics. Households built walls or fences around sick family members. Neighbors avoided entire streets, and some even created watchmen to enforce local restrictions. These grassroots efforts, though primitive, showed early recognition of contagion principles. Interestingly, the plague's impact on quarantine practices extended beyond Europe. The pandemics spread along the Silk Road and Mediterranean routes, prompted health officials in Asia and the Middle East to adopt and adapt isolation methods. It's a reminder that even in an era of limited scientific knowledge, shared human experience spurred innovation. The legacy of these early quarantine measures is profound. They laid the groundwork for modern public health policies, from isolation wards to travel restrictions. The idea that controlling movement can slow disease is now embedded in global health strategies. Yet, quarantine was a double-edged sword. It often deepened social inequities, disproportionately affecting the poor and marginalized who lacked resources to endure confinement. The wealthy could sometimes escape to countryside estates or afford better care, while the poor faced starvation and neglect behind closed doors. You might imagine the emotional toll of quarantine: isolation from loved ones, fear of infection, and the burden of survival in darkened rooms. For some, it was a time of reflection and spiritual reckoning. For others, a descent into despair. And despite all these efforts, the plague still ravaged communities, underscoring the limits of medieval medicine and public health. birth of quarantine as a concept marked a crucial turning point, a recognition that sometimes the best defense is to step back and wait. As you sit in your dimly lit room, the distant sounds of the tolling bell and the rustling of those confined around you, you become part of a long human tradition of isolation born from necessity and fear. Quarantine is no longer just a word. It's a lived experience, a measure of hope against overwhelming odds. The world is changing slowly, and from these dark days, new ideas about health, community, and responsibility will emerge, lessons carved into history by suffering and survival. You might think the Black Death was just a grim chapter of death and despair, but beneath the surface, it set in motion changes that would ripple through history, reshaping society in unexpected ways. As the plague mercilessly claimed lives, it also disrupted the old order, shaking up the economy, labor, and social relations. Imagine a world suddenly unbalanced, a vast population wiped out, leaving gaps in the workforce and empty fields where once communities thrived. One of the most immediate consequences was a severe labor shortage. Fields went untended, workshops stood empty, and households lost many hands. You might have seen the effects yourself: carts with half-filled loads, fewer servants at noble estates, and craftspeople struggling to find apprentices. The scarcity of workers turned labor into a valuable commodity. Suddenly, peasants and laborers had leverage they never dreamed of before. Landowners, desperate to keep their estates productive, tried to impose wage controls and restrictions to prevent workers from demanding higher pay. But with fewer workers around, peasants found they could negotiate better terms or even move to new lands for better opportunities. This shift sowed the seeds for the slow decline of the rigid feudal system. It's fascinating to note that some historians still debate how much the plague directly caused these social shifts versus other long-term economic trends. But few deny that the massive population loss was a catalyst for change. The sudden labor shortage also boosted the bargaining power of surviving workers, leading to improved wages and living conditions in some regions. This newfound agency unsettled the traditional social hierarchy, making nobles and landowners anxious about maintaining control. Meanwhile, the scarcity of workers forced innovation. Landowners experimented with new farming techniques, like using more efficient plows or shifting from labor-intensive crops to livestock grazing. You can almost picture fields turning from rows of grain to open pastures dotted with sheep and cattle, requiring less human toil. Crafts and trades also adapted. With fewer apprentices available, some workshops consolidated or changed their production methods. Guilds, those powerful trade organizations, faced challenges maintaining their influence amid the social upheaval. Interestingly, the plague's impact on wages and labor varied widely by region. Some areas saw rapid recovery and growth, while others lagged behind. Historians still argue over why these differences occurred, pointing to factors like geography, governance, and pre-existing economic conditions. The demographic collapse also influenced urban life. Cities emptied and contracted, but those that survived often emerged stronger, with new opportunities for commerce and cultural development. You might have heard that some urban centers reinvented themselves, laying the groundwork for the Renaissance. At the same time, the massive death toll forced changes in religious life. With so many clergy lost to the plague, churches struggled to fill their ranks. This shortage sometimes led to a decline in the quality of spiritual care and increased criticism of the church, setting the stage for later reform movements. You might find it ironic that the Black Death, while devastating, indirectly challenged the medieval church's authority. People questioned why a benevolent God would allow such suffering, leading some to doubt traditional teachings and seek alternative beliefs or practices. Another profound change touched family structures. With so many parents, siblings, and children lost, family units fractured. Orphans became common, often relying on charity or guild support to survive. The loss of elders meant a break in the transmission of knowledge and tradition. Social customs around death and mourning evolved too. The sheer scale of death overwhelmed traditional rituals. Mass graves replaced individual burials, and public mourning ceremonies became impractical. Yet, people sought new ways to honor their dead, sometimes turning to art, poetry, or music as outlets for grief. In the aftermath of the plague, some regions experienced a cultural flowering as survivors grappled with mortality and the meaning of life. This introspection fed into the artistic and intellectual currents that defined the Renaissance. Economically, the sudden drop in population also caused land values to fall in many areas. This allowed wealthier peasants or merchants to acquire property, altering the social landscape. You might think of this as a medieval form of the Great Reshuffling, where fortunes shifted as old elites weakened. It's also worth noting that the plague accelerated the decline of serfdom in some parts of Europe. Freed from binding obligations, many peasants moved toward tenancy or wage labor, gaining more autonomy. The plague's impact on trade was complex. Some routes suffered long-term decline, while others adapted and grew. Maritime cities, in particular, became hubs for renewed commerce, leveraging their strategic locations and new health protocols. At the same time, fear of contagion sometimes led to increased suspicion of outsiders and foreigners, affecting diplomatic and economic relations. Xenophobia and scapegoating, as we saw earlier, had both social and economic consequences. On a broader scale, the Black Death challenged the very notion of human control over nature. The massive death toll was a humbling reminder of mortality and the limits of human power. This shift in perspective influenced philosophy, religion, and culture for generations. You might also be surprised to learn that the plague led to improvements in public health infrastructure in some places. Municipalities began to regulate waste disposal, street cleaning, and water supplies more rigorously, recognizing their role in disease prevention. In summary, while the Black Death was a nightmare of death and destruction, it was also a crucible of transformation. It cracked open the medieval world, setting in motion economic, social, and cultural changes that reshaped Europe. The darkness it brought was matched by a flicker of new possibilities, a reminder that even in the worst nights, dawn eventually comes. You might not expect it, but during the chaos of the Black Death, some strange and fascinating behaviors emerged, some born from superstition, others from sheer human need to make sense of the senseless. Imagine a world where everyday life is shadowed by fear and uncertainty, and people reach for anything that offers comfort or control, no matter how odd it might seem. Take the flagellants, for instance. You may have heard of them, groups of people who believed the plague was divine punishment, and that self-inflicted pain could atone for humanity's sins. Picture hundreds of men and women marching through towns, whipping themselves with leather straps until their backs bled. Their slow, rhythmic chants echoing in the streets. These processions were part prayer, part penance, and part public spectacle. Their belief was simple. If enough people showed God how sorry they were, perhaps he'd lift the curse. It sounds extreme now, but for many, this ritual offered a sense of purpose amid the chaos. Historians still debate whether flagellant movements actually helped contain the plague or worsened it by bringing crowds together. Probably a bit of both. In the same vein, other folk practices emerged, some charming, some unsettling. People wore amulets to ward off evil, carried herbs to purify the air, or burned incense in hopes of driving away the bad smells thought to cause disease. Remember those aromatic posies people stuffed into plague doctor masks? Well, ordinary folks took a page from that book, filling their homes with rosemary, lavender, and frankincense. Some communities embraced bizarre rituals, like ringing church bells continuously to cleanse the air. The constant ringing became a kind of soundtrack to plague years, a reminder of both faith and fear. You might find it strange that some people even believed that wearing bright colors or avoiding contact with the sick could protect them, or that others thought the plague was spread by the alignment of planets or the influence of comets. Medieval astrology was a serious business, and many turned to star charts for explanations. One quirky fact: in 1345, a comet appeared in the sky, and people were convinced it heralded the coming plague. It's hard not to imagine the nervous glances skyward as the glowing tail traced across the night. The fear of contagion also gave rise to quarantine practices and social distancing long before those terms existed. But alongside these practical measures came stigmatization and scapegoating. Entire groups were blamed Jews, lepers, foreigners, leading to violence and expulsions. It's chilling to realize how fear can turn neighbor against neighbor. You might hear stories of Jewish communities being accused of poisoning wells, and then driven from their homes, even though they were often more careful with hygiene than many Christians. Another strange response was the rise of plague doctors. These figures, with their beaked masks and long robes, became symbols of both dread and hope. The mask's beak was stuffed with herbs and spices intended to filter miasma. Walking through infected towns, plague doctors were both healers and harbingers of death. They carried canes to examine patients without touching them and kept detailed records of symptoms and deaths. Despite their eerie appearance, these doctors often risked their own lives to tend the sick, a lonely and dangerous role. You might also be surprised by the role of animals during the plague. Cats, often associated with superstition and witchcraft, were sometimes killed en masse because they were thought to spread the disease. Ironically, this may have worsened the situation by allowing rat populations to explode unchecked. Conversely, dogs were sometimes kept as companions and protectors, though they too could carry fleas. The relationship between humans and animals during this time was complex, intertwined with fear, superstition, and survival. In the realm of medicine, some healers embraced herbalism and natural remedies. Plants like garlic, wormwood, and rue were popular, believed to have protective properties. While these didn't cure the plague, some herbs may have offered mild antiseptic or calming effects, giving patients small comfort. The plague also influenced art and literature, inspiring macabre themes and symbolism. You may have heard of the dance macabre, or dance of death, a motif showing skeletons leading people of all social classes to their graves. This imagery was a stark reminder of death's universality, cutting across wealth and status. Poets and writers of the time grappled with themes of mortality, loss, and the fragility of life. Their works reflected the collective trauma and the search for meaning in a world turned upside down. Interestingly, some fringe scholars suggest that the plague may have influenced the development of early public health ideas. As communities observed the effects of isolation, sanitation, and hygiene, lessons learned the hard way. Despite all the fear and superstition, moments of kindness and resilience shone through. Caregivers tended to the sick despite the risks. Families tried to maintain rituals and comfort each other in dying days. You can almost hear the quiet prayers, the whispered stories, and the tender touches amid the darkness. The human spirit, even battered and frightened, found ways to endure. So, as you imagine the strange customs and beliefs swirling through plague-era towns, remember that they are not just odd footnotes, but expressions of a society struggling to understand and survive the unimaginable. You find yourself wandering through the shifting shadows of medieval towns as the Black Death continues to tighten its grip. Streets once vibrant with laughter and chatter now echo with eerie silence, broken only by the occasional tolling of a church bell or the distant murmur of mourners. Yet, amid this gloom, life goes on in peculiar and heartbreaking ways, shaped by the plague's relentless presence. One of the most striking changes you notice is the transformation in burial practices. Before the plague, funerals were intimate affairs, filled with prayers, candles, and the gentle comfort of family and community. Now, the scale of death overwhelms tradition. Mass graves or plague pits become a grim necessity. Bodies are stacked in trenches hastily dug outside town walls, sometimes with little more than a hurried prayer. You can almost feel the urgency and despair that drove such decisions. There was no time or manpower to perform proper rites for every victim. This sudden shift in how the dead were handled was traumatic, not just for those left behind, but for society as a whole. The absence of familiar rituals left a spiritual void, complicating grief and mourning. The sheer volume of death also put pressure on clergy, many of whom themselves succumbed to the disease. With fewer priests available, the quality and frequency of last rites and burial ceremonies declined. This shortage added to the sense of abandonment and fear, fueling doubts about divine protection and justice. You might find it surprising that in some places, communal mourning took new forms. People gathered in public spaces to pray en masse or to witness processions honoring the dead. These acts were attempts to reclaim a sense of order and meaning amid chaos. Yet, as you walk through towns, you see that the plague's impact goes beyond death alone. The loss of so many souls disrupts family structures and community bonds. Orphans and widows become tragically common, and social support networks strain under the weight. Communities rally to care for the vulnerable, often relying on neighbors, guilds, or religious institutions. But resources are stretched thin, and desperation leads some to neglect or worse. The absence of loved ones leaves holes that no words or rituals can fully heal. Amid this suffering, superstitions deepen. You might hear whispers of curses or witchcraft blamed for the plague's fury. Trials and accusations of witchcraft rise, sometimes leading to horrific persecution. Fear twists reason, turning suspicion into violence. In some towns, attempts to control the dead's remains lead to bizarre measures. There are stories of bodies being burned, sealed in coffins with heavy stones, or even submerged in water to prevent the spread of disease. These actions reflect a desperate desire to contain the invisible threat. Meanwhile, the economic toll of death weighs heavily. With so many workers lost, fields go untilled, shops close, and production stalls. Food shortages and inflation become common, adding hunger to the list of afflictions. You might notice how the marketplace's vibrancy dims, the barter and trade falter, and wealth concentrates among those fortunate enough to survive. Yet, paradoxically, some survivors find new opportunities. Vacant lands and properties become available, and those with means acquire assets, sometimes improving their status. This reshuffling challenges the established social order, sowing seeds of change. Religious life adapts too. The church, shaken by losses and criticism, sees calls for reform begin to stir. Some clergy emphasize compassion and care, while others double down on warnings of sin and punishment. This tension foreshadows future upheavals. Artists and writers reflect the era's trauma in their works. Dark, macabre themes dominate, with images of death and decay serving as constant reminders of mortality. You might encounter illuminated manuscripts, paintings, or poems portraying the dance of death, where skeletons lead the living to their graves, regardless of status. This cultural response is more than morbid fascination. It's a way of grappling with the incomprehensible scale of loss and uncertainty. Art becomes both a mirror and a balm for a wounded society. You might also notice subtle shifts in medical understanding. Observers begin to record symptoms and disease progression more systematically, laying groundwork for future science. Though true causes remain elusive, these early efforts hint at a growing awareness of contagion and epidemiology. In the background, political structures strain. Monarchs and nobles face reduced tax revenues and manpower, challenging their authority. Some governments implement harsh laws to control labor and movement, sparking unrest. You might witness peasant revolts fueled in part by these pressures. All this turmoil plays out against the backdrop of a world forever changed. The Black Death is not just a moment in time, but a turning point, one that reshapes the social, cultural, and political landscape in ways still felt centuries later. As you absorb the scenes around you, the silent streets, the mourners, the shifting social order, you realize that the plague's legacy is complex. It is a story of death, yes, but also of resilience, adaptation, and transformation. The nightmare of the Black Death continues, but from its dark soil, new beginnings slowly emerge. The landscape you move through has changed in ways both visible and subtle since the plague took hold. The land itself seems quieter, less crowded, and strangely open. Fields that once teemed with workers now lie fallow or overgrown, and villages you once passed through buzzed with activity are reduced to hollow shells. This emptying is not just a sign of loss, but a prelude to transformation. You're witnessing the beginning of a profound reshaping of the European countryside and its people. One of the most immediate effects you notice is the shift in land use. With so many peasants dead or displaced, landlords face a dilemma: how to make their estates productive again with fewer laborers. Some choose to convert arable land into pastures, raising sheep for wool, which requires less hands-on work. Imagine rolling green fields dotted with grazing sheep, replacing one-stended wheat or barley crops. This change has ripple effects, boosting the textile industry and trade, but altering traditional farming communities. Other landowners experiment with different crops, more efficient farming methods, or even renting out land to tenant farmers rather than relying on serfs tied to the soil. This loosening of the old feudal bonds is significant. You can almost feel the tension between landlords trying to maintain control and peasants seizing newfound freedoms. It's worth noting that these changes did not happen uniformly. Regional differences, local laws, and economic conditions shaped how the countryside evolved. In some places, serfdom declines rapidly. In others, it lingers for decades or even centuries. As villages shrink or disappear, many survivors migrate toward towns and cities in search of work and safety. Urban centers, though ravaged by the plague themselves, become magnets for opportunity. This rural-to-urban migration lays the groundwork for the growth of a more dynamic, commercial society. You might notice that this population shift contributes to a more diverse and fluid social landscape. Cities become melting pots where old hierarchies blur, and new wealth emerges among merchants, artisans, and entrepreneurs. The demographic changes also affect family life. With many parents and elders lost, younger generations assume greater responsibilities. Orphans, apprentices, and widows navigate a world transformed by loss and opportunity. Meanwhile, the strain on local governance grows. Town councils and courts struggle to enforce laws amidst the social upheaval. Some rulers attempt to impose wage and price controls to curb inflation and labor demands, but these measures often backfire, inciting resistance and unrest. You might recall those peasant revolts that break out in various regions during this time, fueled in part by these economic pressures and the desire for greater freedom. These uprisings challenge the medieval social order, hinting at future political transformations. The church, too, feels the pressure. Clergy shortages and popular disillusionment weaken its authority. Some religious orders adapt by emphasizing care for the sick and poor, while others cling to traditional doctrine. This divergence foreshadows the religious conflicts and reforms to come. Culturally, the Black Death leaves its mark on art, literature, and philosophy. The somber themes of mortality and the fragility of life permeate creative expression. You might encounter poetry mourning the lost or paintings depicting death as an equalizer, haunting nobles and peasants alike. Intellectually, the crisis stimulates new questions about human existence, the nature of suffering, and the role of fate. Scholars begin to challenge old dogmas, planting seeds for the Renaissance's humanistic spirit. Economically, the plague's aftermath reshapes trade networks. Some cities seize the opportunity to expand their markets and influence, while others decline. The disruption spurs innovation in finance, commerce, and navigation. One quirky detail you might find intriguing. The sudden drop in population led to a decrease in demand for food, causing prices to fall temporarily in some regions, only to rise again as economies adjusted. This fluctuation contributed to both hardship and opportunity. Public health awareness grows as well, albeit slowly. Municipal authorities start to regulate sanitation, control waste disposal, and manage water supplies more actively. Though primitive by today's standards, these steps reflect lessons learned from the plague's devastation. Through all this, the psychological scars of the Black Death linger. The collective trauma influences societal attitudes toward death, religion, and community for generations. You might sense a deeper awareness of life's fragility and a yearning for meaning. Yet amid the grief and upheaval, hope flickers. Survivors rebuild their lives, innovate, and adapt. The medieval world, though shaken, is not broken. So, as you wander this changed landscape, the empty fields, bustling towns, and shifting social orders, you are witnessing not just the aftermath of a nightmare, but the dawn of a new chapter in human history. You move through the quieter, altered towns and villages left behind after the Black Death, sensing the subtle but profound changes in daily life. The rhythms of work, worship, and socializing have shifted, and people's relationships with each other and with death have transformed. This change is not sudden, but a slow, creeping evolution, woven into the fabric of survival and adaptation. One striking aspect is the changing role of religion in people's lives. Before the plague, faith was a steady companion, embedded in every day from morning prayers to weekly mass, from life milestones to community festivals. Now, as the death toll climbs and the clergy shrinks, the religious landscape shifts dramatically. You might notice that people's attitudes range from deep despair to fervent hope, from blind obedience to sharp criticism. The church, once the unchallenged authority on spiritual and social matters, struggles to maintain its grip. Clergy shortages mean fewer sermons, less pastoral care, and sometimes inexperienced replacements. This erosion of spiritual guidance leaves many searching for answers elsewhere. You might hear whispers of heresy, alternative beliefs, or a growing sense of individual faith outside official doctrine. Religious festivals and pilgrimages, once crowded and joyous, are curtailed or abandoned out of fear of contagion. Yet, public processions and prayers continue in some places, reflecting a desperate hope for divine mercy. Historians still debate whether these gatherings helped or hindered the plague's spread. Amid this spiritual uncertainty, some new religious movements and sects emerge, emphasizing personal piety, repentance, and social reform. The seeds planted here will eventually blossom into larger reformations and challenges to the medieval church, you also observe changes in burial customs. With mass graves and hurried funerals becoming the norm, traditional rites lose their prominence. Yet, people find new ways to commemorate their dead. Shrines, memorials, and art dedicated to mourning gain importance, reflecting a collective need to process grief. These cultural shifts are mirrored in literature and art. The rise of the dance of death motif, a macabre parade where skeletons lead all social classes to the grave, reminds you that death spares no one. This imagery permeates manuscripts, frescoes, and sculptures, reflecting a society grappling with mortality. You might be surprised to learn that this period also sparks a flourishing of creativity in some regions. Artists and writers, haunted by loss, produce works of profound emotional depth and symbolism, laying groundwork for the Renaissance's explosion of culture. Economically, you notice the ongoing tensions between labor and landowners. Workers, empowered by scarcity, press for better wages and conditions. Landlords resist, imposing laws to freeze wages and restrict movement. This struggle often leads to unrest and rebellion, like the famous peasants' revolt in England. These conflicts highlight the shifting balance of power and the crumbling of feudal bonds. The social order you once knew is being rewritten, with new classes and roles emerging. In daily life, survivors adapt with resilience and innovation. Trade guilds and merchant associations grow in influence, regulating crafts, quality, and commerce. Towns invest in infrastructure, like roads and markets, to support recovering economies. Public health awareness, though still rudimentary, advances. Regulations on sanitation, waste disposal, and water supply begin to appear more regularly. Communities recognize the importance of cleanliness in preventing disease, even if the reasons remain mysterious. You might find it fascinating that some towns develop rudimentary health boards, appointing officials to oversee quarantine enforcement and cleanliness. These early public health systems are the ancestors of modern institutions. The psychological impact of the plague lingers as well. Survivors carry memories of loss, fear, and uncertainty. This collective trauma shapes cultural attitudes toward death, fate, and the divine for centuries. Yet amid these challenges, hope and renewal emerge. People rebuild homes, restart businesses, and form new families. The medieval world, though forever changed, adapts and endures. As you walk the cobblestone streets, past renewed markets and renovated churches, you feel the pulse of a society in transition. The nightmare of the Black Death has passed, but its echoes continue to shape human experience. You continue your journey through the altered landscape of post-plague Europe, where the scars of the Black Death remain visible. But so do the signs of slow recovery and transformation. One of the most profound changes you witness is in the realm of knowledge, how people understand the world disease, and their own place in it. The plague, devastating as it was, spurred a gradual shift from superstition to observation, planting seeds that would eventually blossom into modern science. Before the Black Death, medical knowledge was a patchwork of ancient texts, folklore, and religious beliefs. Treatments ranged from bloodletting and herbal remedies to prayers and charms. The causes of disease were mysterious and often attributed to divine wrath, celestial alignments, or miasma, bad air. The plague shattered many assumptions and forced people to confront a harsh reality they could not easily explain. You observe that, amid the chaos, some physicians and scholars began to document symptoms, progression, and patterns of illness more systematically. Early epidemiological thinking took root as observers sought to trace the paths of contagion and identify risk factors. Though their tools were limited, this marked a significant shift towards empirical inquiry. One curious detail: some doctors wore those iconic plague masks, with long beaks filled with aromatic herbs. While the design was based on the miasma theory, it also functioned as a crude form of personal protective equipment, shielding wearers from direct exposure. This blend of superstition and practical innovation is emblematic of the era's medical mindset. You might be surprised to learn that universities and medical schools grappled with how to incorporate these new observations. Debates raged over whether the plague was caused by celestial events, corrupted air, or contagion between people. Historians still argue over the relative influence of these competing theories. Meanwhile, the printing press, a recent invention, began to spread medical knowledge more widely. Manuals, pamphlets, and treatises on health, hygiene, and disease prevention circulated among physicians and the educated public. This dissemination of information helped challenge traditional dogma and encouraged more critical thinking. In everyday life, people adapted their habits in response to plague experiences. Practices like washing hands, burning incense, and avoiding crowded places became more common, even if the reasons were not fully understood. These behaviors contributed, to some extent, to controlling disease spread. You might find it interesting that quarantine practices, initially crude, became more standardized and accepted as effective. Cities established lazarettos, or quarantine stations, to isolate travelers and the sick. These institutions laid the foundation for public health infrastructure. The plague also influenced attitudes toward the body and health. People became more aware of personal cleanliness and diet, sometimes embracing new foods or herbal remedies believed to boost immunity. Though medieval medicine was still primitive, these changes hinted at a growing emphasis on prevention. In the intellectual realm, the Black Death challenged established authorities. The Church's inability to prevent or explain the plague fueled skepticism, encouraging some to question religious orthodoxy and traditional scholarship. This questioning spirit contributed to the Renaissance's humanism and later scientific revolution. You might notice that art and literature from the post-plague period often reflect this complex interplay between faith, reason, and mortality. Works explore themes of life's fragility, the search for knowledge, and the tension between old beliefs and new ideas. The social upheaval caused by the plague also affected education. With fewer students and teachers, some institutions declined, but others reformed and expanded their curricula. New disciplines, like anatomy and public health, began to gain prominence. Economically, the labor shortages and social shifts you've seen encouraged technological innovation. Agricultural tools improved and manufacturing techniques evolved, increasing productivity. These advances supported population growth and urbanization in the centuries to come. It's fascinating that the plague indirectly fostered this wave of change by disrupting old systems and forcing adaptation. The nightmare you live through becomes, paradoxically, a crucible for progress. Politically, rulers and governments face new challenges in maintaining order and addressing social demands. The instability you observe leads to legal reforms and shifts in governance structures, reflecting a more complex and dynamic society. Yet, despite all this change, you sense a continuity, a human resilience that weaves through the darkness. People mourn their losses, rebuild their communities, and cautiously embrace new ways of thinking. So, as you move through this transitional world, you understand that the Black Death was not only a devastating tragedy, but also a catalyst for transformation in knowledge, society, and culture. You find yourself drifting deeper into the post-plague world, where the echoes of death still linger, but life is beginning to hum again with cautious optimism. One of the most intriguing changes you observe is in the realm of governance and law, a society struggling to adapt to new realities, balancing old hierarchies with emerging social forces. The massive demographic shifts you've seen millions lost, labor scarce, and communities fractured pose immense challenges for rulers. Kings, nobles, and local officials scramble to maintain control, enforce laws, and keep the economy afloat amid social unrest and shifting power dynamics. One of the key responses is the introduction of sumptuary laws, regulations, dictating what people can wear, eat, or own based on their social rank. You might chuckle at how these laws tried to preserve the old social order by banning commoners from wearing luxurious fabrics or jewelry, as if a velvet cloak alone could fix a society in turmoil. These laws often backfire, fueling resentment and becoming symbols of inequality rather than effective tools of control. Historians still debate how much they actually prevented social mobility or simply highlighted tensions. You'll notice that governments also impose wage controls to prevent laborers from demanding higher pay due to scarcity. The infamous Statute of Labourers in England, for example, tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and restrict workers' movement. Imagine the frustration of a peasant, newly empowered by demand for their labor, being told to stay put and accept old pay rates. Such laws sparked resistance and even rebellion, as you might recall from the peasants' revolt of 1381, where economic pressures and social injustice boiled over into violent protest. The revolt shook the English ruling class and marked a turning point in medieval society. Meanwhile, cities and towns gained more autonomy during this period. You observe local councils and guilds asserting authority, regulating trade and crafts, and managing public health measures like quarantine enforcement. These shifts contribute to the gradual rise of civic institutions and the decline of purely feudal governance. Another interesting development is the evolving relationship between rulers and the church. While the church remains powerful, its influence is challenged by both secular authorities and the growing disillusionment of the populace. Monarchs sometimes clash with clergy over taxation, appointments, and jurisdiction, foreshadowing later conflicts. You might find it fascinating that some rulers use the plague as a pretext to consolidate power, imposing stricter laws or raising taxes to rebuild armies and infrastructure. The devastation provides both challenge and opportunity. Legal reforms also emerge in response to changing social conditions. New statutes address issues like inheritance, property rights, and crime, reflecting a society in flux. The concept of individual rights, while still limited, begins to surface in legal thinking. At the grassroots level, communities organize mutual aid and charity to cope with ongoing hardships. Guilds, religious confraternities, and civic groups provide support to widows, orphans, and the poor, weaving a social safety net amid the instability. Culturally, the memory of the plague influences literature, theater, and visual arts. Morality plays and sermons emphasize themes of repentance, justice, and the fleeting nature of earthly life. The idea of memento mori, remember you must die, becomes a common motif, reminding people of mortality and humility. This cultural atmosphere shapes emerging Renaissance humanism, which blends classical learning with a renewed focus on human dignity and potential. You see the first stirrings of a worldview that balances the inevitability of death with celebration of life. Economically, the period witnesses gradual recovery and diversification. Trade expands beyond Europe's borders, connecting with Asia and Africa in new ways. Mercantile capitalism begins to take shape, with banks, credit systems, and joint ventures emerging. You might be intrigued by the rise of merchant guilds, which protect commercial interests and set standards, laying the groundwork for modern economic institutions. Technological innovations continue to spread, driven by necessity and opportunity. Advances in agriculture, manufacturing, and navigation contribute to population growth and urbanization in the following centuries. Throughout all these changes, you sense an underlying tension between old and new, tradition and innovation, hierarchy and individual agency. The Black Death did not simply end an era, it opened a door to a more complex, dynamic world. As you walk the bustling streets of a recovering town, you glimpse a society wrestling with loss, hope, and the promise of transformation. The nightmare of the Black Death remains a shadow, but beyond it shines the first light of a new dawn. The echoes of the Black Death linger as you wander through a Europe forever changed, a continent grappling with its scars, but also glimpsing the outlines of a new era. One of the most fascinating shifts you observe is in how communities and cultures process trauma and loss, a collective healing that unfolds in subtle, often unexpected ways. Funerary art and rituals evolve dramatically. While mass graves remain a stark reality, the living seek solace through symbols and ceremonies. You might encounter ornate tombstones carved with skulls, hourglasses, and skeletons, a visual vocabulary reminding all who see them of life's fragility and the certainty of death. These memento mori motifs become popular, serving as quiet, ever-present prompts to live virtuously and mindfully. In homes and churches, you notice an increase in votive offerings and devotional objects as people turn inward, seeking personal connections with the divine amid uncertainty. The surge in pilgrimages to holy sites, despite ongoing dangers, reflects a desperate hope for healing and protection. This period also witnesses a flowering of literature and music that confronts mortality with both gravity and grace. Poets compose elegies mourning the dead, but also celebrating life's fleeting beauty. Musicians develop somber chants and hymns, their haunting melodies echoing through stone cathedrals and village chapels alike. Interestingly, some scholars argue that the shared experience of the plague helped forge a stronger sense of community identity. People who survived often felt bound together by their ordeal, fostering solidarity and mutual support. Local festivals and religious celebrations incorporate remembrance of the plague's victims, blending sorrow with resilience. You might find it surprising that this collective memory sometimes took the form of carnivalesque events, where social norms were inverted temporarily, allowing release of tension and reaffirmation of social bonds. These celebrations acknowledged the fragility of life while reinforcing community cohesion. At the same time, the psychological impact of the Black Death left deep marks. Survivors lived with grief, survivor's guilt, and fear of recurrence. Some turned to mysticism or apocalyptic beliefs, convinced that the end times were near. Others sought comfort in emerging philosophical ideas, emphasizing human dignity and reason. These diverse responses illustrate the complexity of coping with catastrophe. There was no single narrative, but a tapestry of emotions and beliefs weaving through society. Economically, you notice that the shifts begun earlier continue to unfold. The decline of serfdom accelerates, and tenant farming or wage labor become more common. This new labor flexibility alters rural life and power relations. Urban economies diversify and expand. Craftsmen innovate, producing goods for broader markets. Trade routes open to new regions, and financial instruments like bills of exchange and letters of credit facilitate commerce. These developments lay the groundwork for capitalism's rise. Politically, the aftermath of the plague encourages centralization of power in some kingdoms, as monarchs seek to rebuild authority. At the same time, local governance and civic participation grow, especially in towns where merchant classes assert influence. You might recall that some rulers use public works projects to stimulate economies and legitimize their reigns. Investing in infrastructure like roads, bridges, and markets. In the realm of health and medicine, the plague leaves a lasting legacy. Although medical science remains limited, the experience encourages greater attention to sanitation and public health policies. Cities adopt regulations on waste disposal, clean water supply, and quarantine procedures, often institutionalizing practices born out of necessity during the plague. You might be amused to learn about some of the strange early public health measures, like banning public spitting or requiring street cleaners. These efforts, while rudimentary, mark important steps toward organized health management. Culturally, the Renaissance begins to flourish, fueled in part by the social and intellectual ferment sparked by the plague's upheaval. Humanism's emphasis on classical learning, individual potential, and critical inquiry takes hold, challenging medieval worldviews. Art and literature reflect a new appreciation for the human experience, its joys, sorrows, and complexities. You see this in the vibrant paintings, sculptures, and writings emerging across Europe. The Black Death's shadow remains, a somber backdrop to these creative achievements. Yet, paradoxically, it also serves as a catalyst, pushing societies to question old assumptions and embrace new possibilities. As you move through this transformed world, you realize that the nightmare of the Black Death was not just an end, but also a beginning, a painful crucible from which a more vibrant, questioning, and dynamic Europe would arise. You stand at the edge of a world that has been reshaped by unimaginable loss and suffering. The Black Death, that dark shadow stretching across the medieval landscape, finally recedes into memory, leaving behind a transformed society, culture, and collective consciousness. As you look around, you notice the subtle yet profound ways in which humanity has begun to heal, rebuild, and slowly, but surely, find its way forward. The physical scars of the plague, empty villages, abandoned fields, and mass graves remain visible. but life pulses anew in cities and countrysides alike. Survivors return to their homes, repair shattered communities, and tend to the living as best they can. You sense the fragile hope that accompanies this slow recovery, a hope tempered by the knowledge that the nightmare could return at any moment. One of the most remarkable changes is the altered social fabric. The rigid hierarchies of feudal Europe have loosened. With labor scarce and landowners forced to negotiate with workers, peasants gain new rights and opportunities. You might imagine the quiet pride of a former serf, now able to negotiate wages or even own land. This shift lays early groundwork for modern notions of individual agency and economic mobility. Culturally, the trauma of the Black Death leaves a lasting imprint. The arts continue to explore themes of mortality, spirituality, and human experience. You might recall the haunting dance of death images and the somber elegies composed during this era. These works serve both as memorials and as reminders to cherish life's fleeting moments. At the same time, intellectual life flourishes. The questioning spirit ignited by the plague challenges traditional authorities and encourages exploration. Universities revive and expand, embracing new disciplines and methods. The Renaissance's humanistic ideals gain traction, emphasizing the potential and dignity of every person. Public health evolves from the lessons learned during the plague years. Cities institutionalize quarantine laws, sanitation regulations, and health boards, creating rudimentary but vital systems to protect populations. These early efforts mark the beginning of organized public health as we understand it today. Politically, rulers adapt to the new realities, centralizing power in some regions while negotiating with emerging social classes in others. The tensions and reforms sparked by the plague foreshadow centuries of change in governance and social contract. You might find it comforting to remember that, despite the horrors, the human spirit demonstrated resilience and adaptability. Communities rebuilt not only their homes, but also their social bonds and cultural expressions. The nightmare that was the Black Death, while devastating, also became a crucible for transformation. As you stand here, feeling the gentle hum of renewed life beneath the surface of this altered world, you can almost hear the soft whispers of those who lived through it, their fears, their hopes, their grief, and their courage. Now, dim the lights further if you wish. Let the quiet settle around you, and let these stories lull you into a peaceful rest. The nightmare is past, and in its place, a new dawn gently breaks. The night deepens, and your thoughts slow, softening with the fading light of day. The terrible weight of the Black Death drifts away, like leaves carried on a calm breeze, leaving behind only quiet reflection. Remember, you are safe now, nestled in your space, far from those dark times, yet connected through these stories. The lessons linger not just of loss, but of resilience, change, and hope. Breathe deeply, feeling the rhythm of your breath match the gentle pulse of history unfolding. Let your mind rest on the slow dance of human endurance, the unbroken thread that weaves us all together. Now, as your eyes grow heavy, let the story settle and drift into the quiet, welcoming arms of sleep. Sweet dreams.